Cold houses don't just make you uncomfortable. They quietly drain money, energy and morale, and during the Great Depression, that reality pushed families to invent one of the most effective DIY insulation systems history ever forgot. This wasn't some niche trick or regional oddity. It was a widespread practical response to desperation. When fuel prices soared, incomes collapsed, and winter didn't care about bank failures, ordinary people figured out how to trap heat using whatever they could salvage. No power tools, no plastic foams, just sharp observation, patience, and a ruthless focus on efficiency. And the result, in many documented cases, was a dramatic drop in heating costs, sometimes close to half. Why heat loss was the real enemy. Homes built before the mid-20th century leaked heat relentlessly. Walls were thin, windows were single pane. Attics were often bare rafters with nothing but air between the living space and the freezing sky. During the Depression, coal, wood and oil weren't just expensive, they were scarce. Families quickly realized that the problem wasn't how much fuel they burned. It was how fast the heat escaped. This insight changed everything. Instead of chasing warmth with more fire, people focused on slowing heat loss. The goal was simple. Keep whatever warmth you already paid for inside the house for as long as possible. That mindset is the backbone of modern insulation science. But back then, it was discovered the hard way. The insulation nobody advertised. You know, it wasn't just a single product. It was actually a layered system, sort of built from newspapers, cardboard, fabric scraps, sawdust, ash, straw, and sometimes even dried leaves. What really mattered wasn't the material itself, but how it trapped air. Air, when you keep it still, is actually an excellent insulator. Depression-era households, well, they didn't really know the physics terminology, but they sure understood the effect. Crumpled newspaper was stuffed into wall cavities. Cardboard panels got tacked behind furniture on exterior walls. Old quilts were hung like curtains over doorways. Attics were packed with loose-fill materials swept up from barns, workshops or sawmills. This wasn't just guesswork. Folks tested results night after night. Rooms stayed warmer, longer. Stoves ended up burning less fuel. Drafts, well, they vanished. Heating bills dropped because, at last, heat finally had some resistance. Newspapers were everywhere, and honestly, nearly worthless once read. That made them just perfect insulation. Families would layer them thick, often crumpling them slightly to increase the trapped air, then pack them between wall studs, under floorboards, or inside makeshift attic barriers. The ink didn't matter, really. The paper density did. Multiple layers slowed convection currents and reduced radiant heat loss. In some homes, walls gained several inches of packed paper, effectively turning thin wooden structures into thermal buffers. What's fascinating is how closely this mirrors modern cellulose insulation, which is, you know, still made primarily from recycled paper. The Depression didn't invent the material, but it perfected the method out of necessity. Sawdust and ash in the attic. Now, in rural areas and industrial towns, sawdust was just everywhere. Woodshops produced it every single day, and you know, coal ash piled up after every fire. Mixed carefully and kept dry, These materials became powerful attic insulation. People would pour them between ceiling joists, creating these thick blankets that stopped heat from rising straight out of the house. The trick really was dryness. Wet insulation just failed. So smart households sealed roof leaks first, then added the fill slowly, tamping it down just enough to prevent settling without crushing those all-important air pockets. This alone, honestly, could transform a house. Heat loss through the roof is one of the biggest energy drains, and blocking it meant stoves worked less while rooms stayed livable longer. So here's the part that, well, most modern viewers tend to underestimate. You see, walls actually radiate cold inward during the winter months. Back in the Depression era, families fought that chill by turning fabric into insulation. Old rugs were nailed right to the exterior walls. Quilts, too, were hung up like tapestries. Sometimes even layered clothing was pinned behind beds and cabinets. These soft barriers, they really helped, cutting down radiant heat loss and, stopping drafts sneaking through all those little cracks. Bedrooms changed for the better, that's for sure. Children slept warmer at night. Condensation, well, it decreased quite a bit. And since fabric was always reusable, nothing ever went to waste. When winter finally ended, the insulation came down and went right back to daily use. Draft sealing, before it even had a name, was, well, a constant battle. Cracks were the enemy. Around windows, under doors, along the floorboards, everywhere. Folks stuffed rags, rope, paper, and sometimes even dried corn husks into those gaps. Door snakes were homemade and, pretty heavy. Windows got sealed up with removable paper panels or cloth strips glued on with flour paste. This wasn't just some crude fix, not at all. It was actually methodical. Families learned which rooms lost heat the fastest, and, well, they sealed those first. The result wasn't exactly luxury, but it sure brought a bit of stability. So, why did all this actually cut heating costs? Well, the claim that heating bills dropped dramatically isn't just an exaggeration. Fuel usage records, household accounts, and even later housing studies all confirm that insulating, even poorly and with low-tech materials, can reduce heat loss by, honestly, 30 to 50%. The depression system worked because it addressed all three forms of heat transfer: conduction, convection, and radiation. Thick layers slowed conduction. Packed materials stopped air movement. Fabric barriers reduced radiant loss. No single trick did the job. The system did. The risks and the reality. Well, not everything was perfect. Fire risk was real, especially near stoves and chimneys. Smart households kept combustible insulation away from heat sources and used metal shields where possible. Moisture was another enemy. Damp materials lost insulating power and encouraged rot. But people adapted. They checked insulation regularly, They replaced wet sections when needed. They learned through experience, not manuals. Why did this knowledge disappear? Well, after World War II, cheap energy and mass-produced materials erased the need for do-it-yourself solutions. Fiberglass, foam, and central heating replaced improvisation. The skills just weren't passed down because, honestly, comfort became automated. But the principles never stopped working. What this means today, well, it's not exactly a call to stuff newspapers into your walls tomorrow. It's really more of a reminder that insulation isn't some kind of magic. It's actually strategy. You know, understanding heat loss gives you control. The Depression proved that, even with almost nothing, people could radically improve their living conditions. And that's the real lesson here. Ingenuity thrives when resources disappear. The bigger survival insight here, well, it's not just about clever tricks or fancy know-how. The forgotten insulation of the Great Depression wasn't about being clever. It was about being observant. Folks really watched how heat moved. They adjusted, they tested, they improved. That mindset is honestly timeless. If this story surprised you, that's exactly why this channel exists. Before modern technology, survival depended on understanding the world deeply and, using it wisely. If you enjoyed uncovering this forgotten solution, hit like so more people can find it. Subscribe to Before Modern Times for real history, real survival knowledge, and the ingenious ideas that built resilience long before convenience. Share this with someone who loves practical history, and stick around, because the past still has a lot to teach us.